History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Darkside podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
My guest on this episode goes by the name of Parallel Mike, a self-sufficiency and economics expert and host of the Parallel Systems broadcast show on YouTube, or at least for now. Joining me today from Poland, Mike, how are you?
I'm very good, Matt. Thank you. And less of the expert. We'll see how we go on this one.
Can you tell us a little about your story, how you ended up moving to Poland, trying to unplug from the grid, hence the Parallel Systems name, your economic credentials, etc.?
Yeah, so basically it started probably 20 plus years ago, Matt, when I first started investigating things like central banking and went down all the rabbit holes that you go down when you look into those things about assassinations of presidents and monarchies, all kinds of things that you get into when you look into finance and the history of the world. And I realized that probably at some point in my life, it would probably be a good idea to get myself out of the way a little bit, because once you know what's happening in the financial system, you can fairly reasonably predict how the future is going to look. And once it got to, say, post 2008, definitely, it really started to seem like the world was heading towards some kind of catastrophic moment where the financial system itself was going to have to be brought down or it would collapse under its own weight. And from there on, we would be going through a period of that would be very chaotic. And we've been through these periods many times before. So if you actually look back through history, we've had many periods where we've had these big global changes. It usually happens about once every 100 years. But anyways, before we get into all that stuff, I'll just say that looking back at history, looking back at financial history, I realized that it's probably, if I wanted to lead any kind of decent quality of life, if I wanted to keep my freedoms as I was born with them, that I'd have to maybe pull away from society a little bit. So around 2016, after I'd met my wife, I used to be an endurance athlete, and also I had a career, and I also was training as a professional athlete. The athletics came to an end, so I was an ultra endurance athlete. I got injured, so then I turned my focus to finance and investment, and really thought, I'm going to really figure this out. I'm going to really learn as much as I can about financial history and investing to try and make a better life for me and my wife, so that we could start this self-sufficient life, get an organic farm, move to a different country. And that's really where it all began, Matthew. So yeah, that was what. Where are we now? The years are just flying by, but yeah, 2016. So we're talking, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Probably 2015 actually was when I really started to think of it. And now here we are in Poland, living on our farm, watching the world go up in flames all around us, and feeling a little bit better that at least we've got some self-sufficiency.
Yeah, certainly a good plan, and something would have loved to have had a head start on if I had. Not squandered money as a youth, but I've been trying to watch your shows quite regularly for about a month or so now. I can't remember how I happened upon them, but I've already said to you privately that my interests were always more in politics and economics, but what I have probably underestimated for years is that it's the economy, stupid, in the words of James Carville. So my economics knowledge is low level, but taking as much as I can from people like George Gammon, Peter Schiff, that kind of general libertarian theory, which is idealistic, and I find some holes in it, unfortunately. So you'll have to excuse me for asking you some brain-like questions here. So I think the main kind of question or idea I would like to explore, and for you to explain, and certainly has been an eye-opener for people in the last couple of weeks, is how we've reached a point in this country, a supposedly sovereign Western democracy, where new Prime Minister Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng can announce a series of tax cuts, some more popular than others, and then have to make a complete U-turn on most measures, including firing Kwarteng due to the current economic climate. We can explore longer-term issues later that you've alluded to already, that the whole thing might be far more systemic than recent history suggests. But in the immediate past, how has this actually happened?
Yeah, so I guess the best way to begin looking at that one is, first and foremost, we have a global debt problem. And within that global debt problem, there are sovereign nations that are on paper all bankrupt, including the UK. The UK is bankrupt on paper. If you had debt levels of the UK, they would come and take your house, they'd take your underwear, they'd take everything, Matt, you'd have nothing left. So that's where we stand as a country. Now, despite that, we have this whole illusion of a system that's functional. And the only reason that is it's a Ponzi scheme. So they keep putting more debt in to pay for the old debt and then to cover the current deficits. Now, in the UK, we've got a huge deficit. And all that means is that we are spending much more than we are earning. So we're basically living on the credit card. So when you had Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng come out the other week and say, we've got a new mini budget and it's going to include tax cuts, the immediate response of global finance was, what the hell are you doing? You've got a massive deficit and now you're increasing the deficit by reducing your tax income. Where's that extra money going to come from? And of course, everyone knows where it's going to come from. It's going to come from lending. So that means the UK is going to go even further into the red. So although they're all living in this fantasy world where they're funding themselves on debt, they still have to maintain an illusion of having some control over that debt. And you could argue that the whole thing is just a lie anyways. But despite that, Matt, people do still have to buy that debt. You know, the UK government isn't just funded by the central bank and taxation. It also has to sell bonds, and those bonds are bought internationally. Now, if you can't find a buyer for those bonds, then you've got another big hole in your budget that you can't fund yourself. So what immediately happened after this mini budget was people rejected the UK as a safe investment. And remember, the UK, the Bank of England, it was the original central bank. And we've got a long history of finance in the UK. So it's like a real embarrassment for the UK for this to happen. But when you had international finance reject the budget and say, we're not going to be buying your debt anymore, then obviously you saw a collapse in the pound. And then, yeah, I mean, as the pound started to collapse, then you had this problem with the pension funds. They had spiking yields. As the bond yields went up, that led to a collapse in their markets because they're exposed to derivatives. And it's just basically a whole domino effect started to happen where you had the domino pushed with the mini budget, and then it led to what would have been a systemic financial crisis because of the collapse of the pension funds due to their exposure to derivatives that were sensitive to interest rate rises. So that's why the U-turn basically, Matt, because if they hadn't have U-turned, the whole thing, as you see it, you'd have gone to the bank and there'd have been no money coming out, would have had a systemic financial collapse. Now, of course, they step in before it gets to that level if they can, and that is exactly what happened. The central bank stepped in and said, we're going to backstop this. However, if they hadn't have done that, it could have got to the point very quickly where it was too late to do anything about it. You'd have just seen banks failing, all the pension funds would have collapsed, people wouldn't have been able to get their money out of the account, there'd have been a bank holiday, and then, yeah, then that would have probably spread outwards as well. You know, you'd have gone, then it would have spread into Europe and then to the US because it's so interdependent now, the financial system. Everyone's interconnected. There's so many counterparties. And there's this big market called derivatives of which these LDI products were a part of. And that market is so toxic and so broad that it's just like a financial nuclear bomb. The moment that is lit, it'll just cascade through the system and there'll be no escaping it. So that's why the U-turned. You talked about a sovereign nation. I would probably argue, Matt, that there is no sovereign nation. There's no, when it gets to politics, they are essentially just the host for a time, like the host of a TV show. They can be gotten rid of, someone else comes in, but there's a whole backstage crew there. And most of that is international finance. So they get to make the rules. They get to decide who's in and who's out, and that's what's happening right now with Liz Truss. She's, you could even argue, Matt, as well, that she was set up that they gave her this mini budget with her having no financial acumen. and probably very weak on geopolitics too, not realizing the Machiavellian game that she's actually in. She was all full of this hubris, thinking, I'm the new PM. You could even argue that they set her up for that fall so they could move the chess pieces around the board a little bit, because it seems to me wild that they would even consider such a budget. You know, it almost feels too exaggerated that someone could believe that that budget was a good idea at that time. So that's just another take on it.
There's a lot to unpack there. Where to begin? Yeah, Truss, I would agree with you there. I think she was placed into this position and handed this script, for lack of a better word, so that she could then take the fall on it. Because what I find quite odd is, whilst not all of the tax cuts were particularly popular, or some of the policies, like removing the bankers' bonus caps, it strikes me that a lot of people have celebrated the failure of a government attempting to do tax cuts, which, just on the face of that, you should want government tax cuts. The less money that goes through the government, the less government interference, the better. But people have celebrated the fact that it's failed. And so it kind of normalizes the idea that, yes, tax going up is a good thing, government spending going up is a good thing, even though the reality is probably that tax is going to go up, but government spending is going to have to go down anyway, because, like you said, we are essentially broke. And also that kind of drags you into, well, if has been placed there, who has placed her there, how have they placed her there, and why have they placed her there? Like you said, it's like the government is like a host, and I use that in the most derogatory term possible, like almost like a viral infection kind of host, bleeding money out of people. Can you, well, to go further on that, you would suggest if you look at Truss's World Economic Forum links and whatnot, you would start to consider, is that who has placed her there? Is that what's pulling the strings? But you start going down a conspiratorial route, it's difficult not to with this sort of thing. But then ultimately, it feels like certainly our vote doesn't count for anything anymore. Somebody else is pulling the strings. Before we go down that route, can you elaborate a bit on government bonds? Like, exactly how does that system work?
Yeah, so it's really simple, Matt. What happens is the government needs to raise money to pay for all of its stupid plans and schemes and fraudulent ideas, such as, Brexit preparations and, we're going to fight a virus, and we all know that money gets siphoned off to all kinds of black budgets, and all of the friends get to take some cream off the top. You've got Matt Hancock's barmate making PPE equipment, all kinds of corruptions going on there. So, it takes a lot of money to fund such extraordinary corruption. You need a lot of that money coming in. So the government, to fund itself, what they do is they take in tax receipts from you and I, but there's a limit to that too, because if you go too far on that, then people get angry and people start to revolt. And throughout history, taxes have been the cause of pretty much every internal revolution in history. It's always through taxation and starvation. So those things are things that governments have to be careful of. There's only so far you can push the average man and woman. So then they start to sell off debt. And what they say to people is, we're going to give you a bond. So you give us some money now, and in 10 years, we'll give you that money back plus so much percent. So it could be 2%, it could be 5%. And depending on how much investors feel the risk of default is on those bonds, they will demand a higher yield. So what you had the other week was you had bond yields spiking, and they actually spiked even higher than Italy and Greece. And as you know, we had the Eurozone crisis. So Greek debt is not appetizing to investors because they are afraid that the Greeks are going to default on it. However, the bond yields of the British gilts actually went even higher than them. So this showed you just how little appetite there was for British debt in that moment. People were placing Italian debt and Greek debt higher than the British gilt. So that was a problem because they need people to fund them. And if there's a big black hole in the budget, then all of a sudden, if international finance is not going to send you that money, where are you going to get it from? You're going to have to raise taxes at home, or God forbid, you're going to have to cut spending and start to get rid of some of these government departments and think tanks and maybe reduce the military. And they don't want to do that because government always want to expand. They always want more, bigger. So yeah, that's what that was the rock and the hard place they found themselves in. Now the central bank did come in, but it felt to me, Matt, like also this was the central bank reasserting its authority over government. And the reason why I think that is because going in to her prime ministership, Liz Truss said, we're going to renew the mandate. We're going to revise the mandate of the Bank of England. And she actually said this publicly. Now, this is something that you don't do. Government and central bank do not get into confrontation historically. You don't call out the central bank because historically the central bank had power over the government. That is how the Bank of England was set up. They got themselves into the country to finance the monarch who was going to war, got himself in debt. So they said, right, we're going to fund you. And what you've got to give us control over the entire treasury of the nation. So all deposits, all lending, it's just us. So it was a private bank that came in. So when it came to discussions between Parliament or whoever's in power and the central bank, there always had to remain this air of respect. So already Liz Truss had put herself in a difficult spot by calling out the Bank of England and saying, we're going to look over your mandate to see if it needs updating. And that was quite controversial. Now, she also called out Andrew Bailey, who's the governor of the central bank, just the other week. And he said something back in the media, which was saying that he didn't call her out directly, but he said what government needs to stop doing is thinking they can just spiral out of control or something along those lines. So there's this kind of tit for tat. And it feels to me like Liz Truss has almost got herself on the wrong side of the bank, and the bank has now reasserted its authority. And just this week, it's been announced that the government are going to pay 11 billion to the central bank to pay them back for their losses on these bonds that the central bank had to buy to bail out the pension funds. So again, this kind of adds more credence to this idea that the central bank is actually the one in control here. And they said to the government, right, you're going to get rid of Liz Truss, or we're going to put Hunt in, get rid of Kwarteng, we're putting Hunt in. And they're the ones kind of maneuvering the chessboard here rather than Liz Truss thought she was the one in power and she could control the central bank. It feels to me like it's the opposite way around here.
So with that in mind, I was watching the BBC News the other day, which I really shouldn't be doing. But I was seeing the reporter was outside the Houses of Parliament, and there was some guy walking behind with a sign that said Tory bullshit. But this is ultimately, it's systemic, isn't it? I mean, are people wasting time supporting any opposition party here? Because ultimately it doesn't matter who is in government. If the Labour Party come in, you're just going to have exactly the same policies anyway in terms of economics.
Personally, that's how I see it. It's, to me, I always joke that it's like asking what topping I want on my shit sandwich. That's essentially what we're being offered. Do you want pickle or do you want cheese? At the end of the day, you're getting the same thing. Or another way you could look at it, Matt, is it's like we're all on a train and we're arguing about which carriage is best. But at the end of the day, while we're all arguing about these minute details, which carriage is best, who gets the window seat, what's going on in carriage 5, while that's happening, the train is still going in one direction, and eventually it's going to arrive at a destination. And if you look back, if you take that 10,000-foot view of, let's say, the last 50 years, but you could stretch this out even longer, but particularly the last 50 years, going back to things like the Club of Rome, the origins of the World Economic Forum, the UN, all of those things have their own agenda that is supranational. So it doesn't really matter which country you're located in. They're all headed down the same path. Now, of course, within your country, how you experience those transitions, it will matter if you've got X or Y in power. You know what I mean? There can be a different flavor or different feel to a different government. However, they are still part of this overall agenda, and they are placed into power. Everyone that gets into power today has been through so many filters before they get there, that by the time that you get the chance to vote on them, they are already fully bought and paid for, and they're in on the agenda. Now, if they're not, well, you saw what happened in the 1960s when JFK got shot. You know what I mean? When he called out the military-industrial complex and he asked for peace, he said, we're going to try and pursue peace with the Russians, the Soviets. And what happened? It was about 3 months after his peace speech, he got shot. So, that's what happens if you go against these bigger powers, these international money men, the bankers, the military industrial complex. Today we've got big pharma too. All of those people have the levers of power because they're the ones that control money, and they're the ones that control industry. And there's plenty of quotes throughout history you can turn to, but I think it was Mayor Amstel Rothschild who said, I don't care who you put in power, whoever controls the money controls the country. And it's true. And we saw that just the other day in Great Britain. That is exactly what we saw. What we saw was Liz Truss come out and say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And international finance said, no, you're not. And then what happened? She immediately U-turned, somebody got fired, and now it's looking like her neck's on the chopping block. So, like you said, Matt, you can vote, you can, but I personally would not allow myself to debase myself and care that much that you're engaging with a system that is illegitimate to begin with. So in my opinion, you need to start building that parallel system, which is where the name of my podcast and broadcast comes from. It's about saying, actually, the more we engage with it, the worse it gets. It's like we're feeding the beast. So what we need to do is take ourselves as far as we can out of that system and create something separate, and then hope over time that as people see the true face of the system that they're in, they start to say, right, I've had enough of this death cult. Because that's essentially what it is. It's built on misery. It's built on war. It's built on, it's built off the back of millions of people dying from famine and disease. It's a death cult. So what you want to do is you want to get yourself out of that and build something nice. Start with yourself, start with your own life, then start extending it to other people, and then hope that other people over time will come in and join you. I know that might sound a little bit heavy, but the more you look back through history, the more you start to realize that what's happening today is just a repeat of a cycle that just keeps going on and on and on. And the more that we engage with politics and think we can fix it, I think you're wasting your life. It's a dead-end road. What you need to do, and the only people who have a chance of actually having a happy life are people who take themselves out of that. And don't fill your mind with what's happening in number 10 and who's going to get voted in and out, because I think it's a bit of a theatre, Matt, to be honest. And I think the more you look at history, the more you'll start to see it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wouldn't say it's heavy. I think people just have to go through the journey of engaging with politics to then ultimately disengage from it, if that makes sense. Like until you have, like you said, tasted all the flavors of the shit sandwich, you don't realize that that's all that's on the menu, essentially. That's why I think people are wasting their time, standing outside Parliament with their signs and blaming it all on the Tories and everything, because a change of government is not going to improve matters. It's just going to they're just going to learn in 5 years' time that it's exactly the same thing, which is why I think it's quite curious. Like if you rewind to 2008, 2009, with the Occupy movement, do you think that was natural and organic? And do you think people at that time had kind of worked things, more people on a greater scale had worked out that the system was broken, and subsequently that movement has been infiltrated, broken up, and pushed towards different things, such as woke organizations and people cheering on corporate interests now instead of trying to actually affect change?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? We had this Occupy Wall Street moment, and although they wasn't exactly correct in what they were thinking, they were in the right ballpark. They were getting there. It should have been Occupy the central bank, but it wasn't. It was Occupy Wall Street, but they were getting there because what they were understanding was that international finance was pulling the strings. We've got, the socialization of losses and the privatization of profit, which is not capitalism. It's where we bail out when they take big risk bets and lose. But when they win, we don't get anything. And, we've seen that over the past 50 years when in real terms, our average salary has just gone down and down and down. Like to buy a house today, you're talking 11 times the average salary. Whereas when our parents were younger, we're about the same age, it was about 2.5 times the average salary. So this shows you just how corrupt it's become. So I think Occupy Wall Street was in the right ballpark. And, I can't answer whether they were, purposely disbanded and infiltrated, but, it's curious that they just disappeared. And like you said, when you look at the activist crowd today, every mainstream activist movement is completely infiltrated. Completely infiltrated. Every single one of them is demanding what is essentially the Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2050 goals. And of course, you need that. And again, this goes back to what I said a moment ago about making this illusion that you've got a choice and this illusion that we're in some kind of struggle. There is no struggle there. Everyone is being pulled in the same direction. The activist groups are there just to make it seem like there are people fighting the government and, there's this kind of battle going on between the two. There's no battle there. They're essentially just another arm of the state now. They're demanding that the state do what the state wants to do anyways. It's us as perceivers that they're trying to convince. They're trying to, manipulate our perception. So we believe that it's some kind of movement that's demanding it. And, maybe we should be doing this because people are calling for it. The young people are rising up. But all of that is just a fantasy, So, and when you look at the movements, you can see it. If you really look at them, all of the logos that they use, they're all very vivid. They're all of the same type. They all use the same type slogans. It's usually 3 words. They're the kind of people where if you ask them to give more than 1 sentence answer, they get confused and they trip over themselves. They don't know what they're doing. And it's actually really pathetic to see. At least when we was younger, our radical movements were actually about something. I was really into the punk scene, and I used to go to protests and things when I was younger. Maybe I was misguided too. However, at least we was reading philosophy, and at least we had some views on the world. But these young people today, sad to say, they are, they're really lacking in critical thought. I mean, I saw a kid just the other day saying that farming is the biggest polluter on the planet, and we need to end farming. And it's like, well, okay, well, let's all starve to death then, because the only reason humans exist is because of farming. Agriculture is why we're here today. So crazy ideas, crazy world that we live in.
Yeah, I don't really know what they want to achieve, some of them. Like the lot that threw tomato soup over the painting last weekend. Like, in the name of just stop oil. Like, there's no thought out thing there. Like, what happens if you just stop oil? What do you think will actually happen? Everything collapses, but like you say, it's as if the collapse is intentional and that we are being driven towards that collapse, regardless of who is driving the metaphorical train that you mentioned earlier. It certainly seemed, like you said, about the socialization of losses. That's interesting, because it seems like we are moving towards a more like socialist / communist type system. But theoretically, at least on paper, we have capitalism at this point. I mean, I mentioned libertarian ideas earlier. Is what's happening now, is it a failure of unrestricted capitalism or interfered capitalism?
I think it's a failure of human psychology, and it's one that you can't get away from. At the end of the day, wherever you look throughout history, there is corruption. And, it happens where you start off with people who have somewhat pure ideas and they get together. This is the story of America. The founding fathers, what they were trying to do was to look at what happened in Great Britain and in England and make sure that never happened in America, which was where you had tyrannical monarchs get into power, enact new taxes that just destroyed people, subjugation, forcing people to follow one religion, land confiscation. All of these things happened in the UK under tyrannical monarchs. And when the founding fathers created America, they sought to create the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to make sure that this didn't happen there. And that's why people were allowed to have free speech and were allowed to have the right to own a gun and all of these things. So, it started off with somewhat pure idea. However, if you look at where America is now, it's probably the most corrupt country in the world, after Ukraine, perhaps. I know Ukraine was voted the most corrupt country in the world up until 2022. However, before that, so let's say America is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And, that's just what happens over time. If you look back at any society, sadly, that's what happens, because, people get comfortable and then they want to keep their comfort. And then they realize that actually there's other people who want comfort too. But if they have to give some of their comfort up, then what happens? We've got to start to share things out, and they don't like that. They want more, and that's just human nature. So Whether you choose capitalism, communism, or any other kind of idea, it will get corrupted over time. A lot of people say, well, we've never had real communism. We've never had real communism. And it's like, we've never had real anything. And that'll happen again. You could come up with the best theory on money, in history. You could be an economics genius. You could come up with the best system and it will still get corrupted because we're human beings and we're corruptible. You might not be. You might follow all the rules, but the guy next door to you, he's not going to follow the rules. And eventually he'll get an advantage. He'll keep the advantage. And then he'll get together with other people who are also taking advantage and saying, come on, guys, if we all get together, we can take double advantage over everyone. And that's what happens. So what it really is just a failure of human nature. And I don't think there is a perfect system. What you have to do is just have some fundamental ground rules, like property rights. You should have the right to own a piece of property and it should be yours. And nobody should be able to come and mess with that. Nobody should be able to come and take it off you. We should have a police force, as a reasonable sized police force that is there just to protect these fundamental rights. Your property rights, your right to life. Nobody's allowed to come and take your life. However, if they try to, you're allowed to take their life, or at least defend yourself up until that point if you have to. That should be allowed because that means that you live in a fair society. So what we should have is these simple structures. Now, the economic system that you build around that, I say that comes secondary to the fundamental rights that you have, your inalienable rights. And capitalism, whether you like it or not, it has brought about the most prosperity in the widest base of all systems. Now, what we've got today certainly isn't capitalism, and it needs completely cleaning out. However, until we find a system that is superior in terms of its broad spread of wealth distribution as capitalism has been, and giving people the opportunities so that you're not born into a certain stratification where you can never leave that, like we had under a monarchical system where you've got the king. We've got King Charles III now. Like, what's he doing as king? It's because he was born there. So, it's a class structure. Then you've got the aristocrats, then you've got the knights or the army, and then you've got the serfs and the peasants. Whereas at least under capitalism, you could go from being the serf or the peasant. You could go to be not the king, but you can get pretty far up there. You know what I mean? So it gives you that social mobility as well, which other systems didn't have. Now, communism, well, we know, communism is a dead end. That's been tested and tried too many times. That really is just out and out totalitarianism. So again, I think we got it right. I think we was on the right path. However, human nature is a nature of corruption. Hence why you need a strong legal body that is going to enforce laws that are agreed upon, not tyrannical laws, ones that we all agree upon. And that's really how you start a country. And, we've seen the experiment in America. It led to the greatest wealth in human creation in human history. But we're coming towards the end of that, sadly. And, I think America is now in its final days, in my opinion, as an empire, at least.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's quite a lot of different directions I'm contemplating taking this. I don't know whether to go down. You mentioned creating a country. I'd probably want to speak a little bit about Scottish independence at some point here. The fall of America, I would tie that in with Trump, Brexit, reality of voting and whatnot. But before we get to those little bits, you mentioned earlier death cult, and you just mentioned property rights. Mortgages, of course, literally translate as death contract in French. Government bonds obviously being like mortgages, but on a grander scale. Why are mortgages offered in the interest format that they are? I know this is a bit off the track, but I mean, if somebody is to borrow 100,000, for example, why does the interest have to be compound? Surely, 10% total interest would be fair over a period of time, so you just pay back 110,000, for example. Why is it done in such a way that, like, I was playing with a mortgage calculator the other day, like what would happen if my mortgage went up to 7-8%, and instead of paying back 120,000, for example, you're paying back 230. It strikes me as like absurdly unfair to common people, but it is implemented upon us by, like you say, the central banks as opposed to the government. The government can't actually do anything about it. So why are we in this situation with mortgages?
Yeah, so really what happened was thousands of years ago, some people figured out that if you can charge interest on a loan or lending money, that you can control that person. That person is now in bondage. And throughout history, there's been so many different occurrences where they've argued whether they should be allowed. They banned it. They brought it back in. I think it was Henry VIII who brought it back in the UK, and it's got a special name. It's called usury. And there used to be laws prohibiting it because it's so destructive in society. It's so destructive to have people that are not only having to repay their debt, but they're having to give interest. And of course, when you extrapolate that out to an entire system, it basically becomes a Ponzi scheme. You create more and more debt, and when people can't pay that debt, and when you add interest to that debt, where does the extra money come from to pay the interest? Well, of course, people take out more debt, and that's how it happens. And that's what's happened on a global scale now. And that's why the system is now insolvent, and we're getting to the end of it. Any small tremor now that would have been withstood in a resilient system, say a resilient monetary system, say 50 years ago, even today, will bring down the whole system. It doesn't take much to bring down this system because it's so swimming in debt. And so going back to what you were saying about mortgages and things like this, I always mention that, whether you agree with paying interest on loans or not, the way it is today is the amount of interest people are having to pay, and the corruption of the system is so vast that you really are on the limit. The average person with the average salary is on the limit when it comes to a mortgage. A 4% mortgage today is equivalent of the average salary it's the same equivalent amount you're paying on the average salary as a 14% mortgage in the 1980s. That's a 4% mortgage today. So if you've got mortgages at 7% today, that'll break the back of the average man or woman. They just can't afford it. And that's before you start to factor in things like food price inflation, the cost of energy, and all the other things that have gone up. So, it's really about control. I mean, that's where it comes from. When you look at central banking, it's just, when you have a debt to somebody, that person has a degree of control over you, right? And if you've got an entire country that is beholden to a central bank, then that whole country is now being controlled by the central bank. Because if the central bank refuses to give money or spikes up interest rates, then all of a sudden the country's in financial chaos. So, it's just an extrapolation of that system. You can take it down to the most raw kind of human relationship where, you've got, for example, you might have a pimp, and he gets a woman into prostitution because he's, you see this with human traffickers. They say, right, we're going to traffic you across, but now you owe us a debt. And to pay back that debt, you've got to go into prostitution or whatever it is. You see it with drug smugglers too. They say, right, we've smuggled you across, but now you've got to take these drugs around the country for us, be a drug mule. This actually happens. So it's that form of bondage. And when it comes to interest, it's just a professionalized form of that. It's something that we've accepted. But if you go back to the Bible, the one time Jesus showed an act of violence was when he flipped over the money lenders' tables. So it's very deeply rooted in our history. If you look back about this whole wrangling over interest and whether it's legitimate, and if you go back to the days of Babylonia, they used to have debt jubilees every 7 years because it was so destructive. So you could have people get into debt, but every 7 years they'd wipe the slate clean and start again. Because if you didn't, then you started to get into this human bondage type situation where people were so heavily indebted, they were losing the farms, and it led to this kind of meta instability in society. But what we've done in the modern era is we've just institutionalized it. So now that's the way you should live. You should be living in debt. It's normal. And the more debt that they create, the more expensive things get, like education, for example. Education used to be affordable. However, the moment they started giving student loans, then all of a sudden the university could say, right, well, now you can have a 90 grand education rather than a £2,000 education because you can get the debt for it. And it's the same with housing. It's the same with, anything else you can put in that place. If you add this kind of debt system to it, then people can start to really wring people dry. And, most of us are going to live and die, live our entire lives in debt and die in debt as well. And, fortunately, right now, as it stands, you can't pass your debt on to your children. But I won't put it past them to try that.
Yeah, that's probably imminent. That's something
they're actually talking about this already, Matthew. They're already talking about this happened in Japan. In Japan, there was multi-generational mortgages. You could have a mortgage that spanned 2 or 3 lifetimes if you wanted. So, and they've spoke about this in the UK recently. They spoke about it just a few months back. I saw a few articles talking about maybe that's the solution to young people getting on the property ladder, intergenerational mortgages. So, that is actually the birth of that system.
Yeah, that is a bit wild, isn't it? It's like selling your unborn child a load of debt before you've even contemplated having a child. It's wild. You mentioned the imminent collapse of America, and you were also speaking about like the creation of America being born out of rights and freedoms. The United Kingdom also has a reasonably rich history if you cherry pick certain moments of rights and freedoms and whatnot. Do you think that if you rewind to 2016 with the Brexit vote and to an extent the Trump vote, that we are subsequently been punished for voting the wrong way, because it feels like there's been intentional destabilization from, you would argue, globalist forces, because we voted for Brexit was to try and decouple a little bit of globalization. People voted for Trump, which he obviously ran on an anti-globalist platform. Do you think, like you say, subsequently there has been a little bit of punishment and an attempt to weaken the general public of Britain and America because we are arguably the least susceptible and the most likely to push back against things like social credit systems and advanced technocracies?
Yeah, the way that I look at it, and I'm not saying that I'm 100% right on this because it's very, very complex. We don't know just how people cannot grasp just how complex the system above us is. It's extremely complex. So occasionally we do get glimpses into it. And, as humans, we like to kind of bring things down to a manageable level in our minds to try and make it more understandable and relatable. But it's extremely complex. And there's so many different factions above us that are also working together, but at the same time opposing one another and wanting a bigger piece of the power pie for themselves. And, that happens all the time. So it's not quite so simple. But the way that I personally frame it is that when they put somebody like a Trump in power, when they give us something like a Brexit vote, it's just to divide society more. It's just to polarize. If you look at the characters or the issues that they bring to the public, Trump, extremely divisive. Extremely divisive is going to cut society 50-50. And that's what they want. So they want anybody that is potentially going to come up for power, particularly in America. This is their favorite way of doing it, is to have somebody that is really going to impress one side of society and the other society is going to repulse, such as Biden right now, and then vice versa. And they flip between the two. And that's really useful for them because what that means is that at all times they've got 50% of the people that are so hateful towards the other 50%. It doesn't matter what their guy does or says. They're going to support him just because they don't want to be associated with the other ones and they dislike the other ones so much. And, you can upset a lot of people by saying that when it comes to Trump. A lot of people saw Trump as a savior, and they still do. However, in my opinion, Trump is just another product of the same system, and he is a part of their system. And he was put in there for a purpose. So was Brexit. It's no surprise that it happened around the same time before COVID, because going into COVID, remember, this is a once in a multi-generation event that they were trying to pull off. They needed to go into that as confidently as possible, believing that they could divide society and at least get 50% of the people to go along with it, at least 50%, because were it to fail, we would be in a very different world than where we are now. Remember, they put so much time, money, and planning into those 2 years. They had to make it successful. So I think the things that, if you go back before that and look at the things that happened in the build-up, particularly in politics, it was to radicalize people more and more and to make them more confrontational towards one another. Society became increasingly fractured along different lines, whether it was gender, sexuality, skin color, everything. And that was to make it so that when we got to this stage of the game where we are now, it was much easier to control people. You know what I mean? Everyone had their own little tribe, and they give different propaganda to each tribe. Because it's no surprise that the people who are most opposed to the vaccine in America, for example, would consider themselves MAGA or Trump supporters. You know, it was that kind of faction. So what they needed was people going into, for example, 2020 and 2021 to almost completely disassociate themselves from Trump supporters, you know, to at least get a critical mass that would go along with it. And that's kind of how they played it. And I think it's the same with Brexit. You know, it was the same rhetoric. It was the same kind of propaganda. It was saying that half of society is racist, half of society is racist, and, you know, they can't stand minorities, and they're thick and they're idiots, and the working class, and the other half are, you know, educated and cultured Europeans who are voting to stay in the European Union. You know, it was the same kind of divisive kind of spin. And once you got to the COVID agenda, it was exactly the same kind of othering. It was like, no, the people who don't want to take an experimental drug, they are anti-science, they're uneducated, it's the dumb working classes, it's those same racists that voted for Brexit. You know what I mean? It was the same kind of painting of the picture. Now, they didn't do it too overtly because, of course, they needed those people to take the drugs as well. So, you know what I mean? They can't out and out other people by saying because you're part of the working class or because you're a Trump supporter, because they still want to convince them as well to go along with the agenda. But within each different camp, there was certain types of propaganda that would feed into those pre-existing biases and discriminations they've got towards other groups. So, you know, if you looked at, say, the typical Guardian reader, they would frame it as uneducated people not wanting to take part. But if you looked at, say, the Sun newspaper, they would then frame it as people who were, I mean, the Sun newspaper might say, oh, it's the migrants in the country that are not going to take it, and they're going to threaten your life by not taking it. You know what I mean? They'd create a special spin that kind of went towards their prejudices. So yeah, so I know that upsets some people because we all want a savior. We all want to feel like Donald Trump was coming in to save us, and like Brexit was our choice, and we've got that power. But, you know, personally, no, I think it's part of the same corrupt beast that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think all of that's fair. When you were speaking about Occupy movement, you said that, like, there was elements of it that they were, it's difficult to articulate as follows, so trying to bear with me. You said there were elements of it that they were getting correct, like people were like opening their eyes in a kind of correct direction. I would probably argue that the same kind of thing happened within the Brexit movement. The same kind of thing happened within the Trump movement. The same kind of thing happened with the people who are on our side of the COVID arguments. Is it not quite a risky strategy from the agenda creators to funnel so many people, probably more so than, you know, the last 30 or 40 years, funnel so many people, like, have them skating around the edges of the truth as opposed to keeping them entirely in the dark, if that makes sense? It strikes me as like a risky strategy that could backfire on them, but obviously they have backstops to that, e.g. infiltrating the Trump movement with QAnon and then causing January the 6th to happen so that they can then go, oh, actually, we're all radical lunatics all along, as opposed to, actually, some of you got some of this correct, even though we fed you some of this. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to point out there?
It makes perfect sense. I think it's a really astute point as well. And yeah, I can't answer whether it's whether it'll backfire on them, because we know that they like to, you know, we need an internal enemy. And right now, it used to be the internal enemy was somebody who was truly an other. So it'd be like, you know, it'd be somebody that had come into the country. So it could be a migrant group, or it would be somebody that was in a really small minority. So it'd be, say, during the Vietnam War, it would be people that were opposing the war, that other them. Whereas what you're rightly pointing out, that what they're trying to do is actually create two distinct camps in society that are equally large, at least in America. You know, Trump got record votes in the recent election besides Biden, who got more than him apparently. So you're right. There's a huge group there
right.
that they are, that they're trying to other, and it's dangerous for sure. But I also think in their mind, first and foremost, they've got complete faith in their propaganda machine that they can sway the consciousness of enough people, and I think they truly believe that at the flick of a switch they can turn on a crisis of their making. And to some degree it's true. I mean, if you look at 2020 and 2021, look how powerful that was. How powerful their mind control machine was. And this was just through typical hypnosis techniques and psychological conditioning techniques, repetition of a phrase, creating an environment of fear and anxiety, making people feel isolated, giving them a parental type figure who will tell them it's all going to be okay if you do X, Y, and Z. This is classical conditioning that they were using, and they were doing it through devices and technology. If we'd have took away all the devices, all the screens, people would have had no idea that there was anything, because there was nothing. I mean, I'm not saying there wasn't a virus, but what I'm saying is, if you look at where it was on the scale of risk to a person, you're talking about it was similar risk to getting attacked by wild dogs. That's about the level of risk there was. So
it wasn't people dropping dead in the street like we were originally advertised that it was going to be.
Exactly. And it makes you really think about those videos that were coming out of places like Italy and things like what truly was going on over there. I mean, I remember the early videos was showing you mass graves that were being dug. So when you look back at that now, you think, wow, they really went into overdrive on this whole fear machine that they created. But it worked. It did work, and people gave up critical thinking and rational action. And the way it worked was through our connection to devices. It was through people's phones, through their screens and TVs. And also, when you went out in public, you'd see signs everywhere and symbols and the same colors. It was this repetition. So I guess for them, they feel like that is powerful enough to control the masses. And it doesn't worry them if they wake 20% of them up or 30% up, and maybe because they've got another plan for that, like you said, like who knows? These people are psychopathic. The people that are doing these things are not to be trusted. So in my opinion, I would say I personally think they're wrong. I personally think that people are becoming more aware. They're becoming resensitized to real things, real information. They're realizing that lots of this stuff that's gone on is harmful, it's toxic, and they're starting to do things like what I'm talking about, which is, taking yourself out of their systems. Technology, you don't need it in your life. In fact, technology is the mechanism in which we're all being enslaved. If you've got a phone, that phone's now spying on you. It's listening to you. It's recording your movements. We all know this. It's all come out in the past few decades, but people haven't took it seriously. However, now we're getting to the real sharp point of the knife where people are being told, oh, actually, you're not going to be able to engage with society if you don't do X, Y, and Z. You're not going to be able to buy from a shop if you don't have the right QR code. Oh, actually, we might take you to a central bank digital currency and a social credit score. All of a sudden, people do care because they're realizing, it's not just some CIA guy listening now and again if they want, if you're a target. It's actually, no, this is everyone caught up in this big electronic control net, and people don't like that. It's all they haven't hid that from us. It's all kind of, like you said before, it's all kind of out in the open now. So it worries me a lot, Matthew, because it feels like why are they being so brazen, and why do they not care? Like what is the next stage if it goes wrong for them? Like who knows? Like I don't put anything past these people.
No, nor do I. You mentioned devices and the central bank digital currency and whatnot. It does feel like the future generation who have become glued to these devices, it does feel like they're being primed to normalize the idea that everything is done through their phone, everything's monitored. Currency, by what you mentioned, you said there you wouldn't put anything past them, and I mean, we've certainly got the precipice of a nuclear World War III at the minute. Do you think there is the potential for it's difficult to say this without sounding insane, obviously, but it does feel like would organize some sort of event which would then, shut down the electric grid, the internet grid, and whatnot. And then when everything switches back on again, they'll have this new system ready to go with a new financial system based on central bank digital currencies, based on social credit scores and whatnot. Do you think that is a realistic possibility, or do you think they're just going to keep trying to poorly manage and paper over the cracks of this centuries-old system of economics that is currently in place?
No, I think it's impossible. Matt, the current financial system is on its last legs. Like since 2008, it really was just a case of buying themselves time. And what they did was they took basically what you had the banks starting to fail. So you had all financial institutions were going insolvent. And had they allowed that to happen, it would have come down there and then. So what they did was they passed on the problem from the banking level to the sovereign level. So the sovereign level now is all of the governments of the world, all of the countries of the world, should I say, not governments, countries, are now insolvent. That's where the debt now lies. Now, there's nowhere above that for it to go. You've reached the end of the road there. So all they did was they bought themselves time. And it makes sense that this whole period of crises that we are now in has just begun as we was getting to the very limits of that system, because in 2019, towards the end of the year, there was the stress crack starting to show that we was heading towards another imminent financial crisis. So they were going to have to print lots and lots more money to try and fill the gap and give themselves another few years. And they did that because COVID came along. And as COVID came along, it gave them the excuse to print trillions and trillions. In fact, it was 40% of all dollars in existence came from that 1 year. So, there's an extreme amount of money. However, the problem there was, Matt, that all of a sudden, what they had been doing behind closed doors, which was quantitative easing, which made everything appear normal, but it wasn't, because we had asset price bubbles that were growing, say in the housing market, the stock market, in art, in fine wines, taking interest rates to 5,000-year lows. But for the average man and woman on the street, everything appeared normal. It's like, 2008, nobody even knows what happened in 2008. It's a long time ago. However, behind the scenes, it was not normal, and people knew that, and people in finance understood that once they started down this path, they could never leave. All you can do is keep printing money and money, and that's fine up until the point where that money starts to trigger inflation. Once you get inflation back, then you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because what would normally happen when you have inflation is you raise interest rates, and you raise interest rates to bring down inflation. That's what happened in the 1970s. We had interest rates above 15%. And that was to bring down inflation of a similar amount. The problem we've got now is interest rates at 3% or 4% bring down the system, because there's so much debt in the system and the governments themselves are insolvent. So this goes back to what we started with Liz Truss and the gilts, that nobody will buy that government debt. If they think the government's insolvent and they don't trust it can pay back its debt, they're not going to buy the debt. So the governments themselves can't fund themselves. So that's why we're in this situation now. And you've got governments trying to fund themselves with debt monetization, which is just outright debt monetization, where they go to the central bank and say, we need some money, and the central bank prints the money for them. And that's what happened in 2020 and 2021 in the UK. But people said, oh, it's only for a temporary crisis. But now it's happening again for an energy crisis. It's happening again to fund wars in other countries, So we're getting to that stage now where the currency itself has lost all integrity. The currencies themselves are just going to start to hyperinflate. And there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to turn now. They're in that rock and a hard place situation, which you always get to at the end of a monetary system. Fiat monetary systems, we've had 10,000 fiat currencies throughout history. The average lifespan of one is 30 years. Every single one has failed. We've had a fiat monetary system now since 1971, August the 15th, when President Nixon took us off the Bretton Woods system. Of course, the US created the petrodollar system, which gave it some kind of added fuel. But even that's now failing, because all of the energy producers of the world are saying we're actually leaving the dollar. We don't want your dollars anymore. So then the whole petrodollar system falls apart. And as soon as that happens, which is happening now, you're in the end game. There's nowhere to go after that. And of course, this is one of the reasons why the US is enacting a proxy war against the energy producing nations, particularly Russia, because they're trying to build this separate system, to extricate himself from the dollar. And once the dollar is no longer the global reserve, then the US has got nothing. It's just got a military. All it can do then is enact war. And that makes sense why we're in a period where we've got discussions of war, because that's the US. That's the last resort for the US now. If you can't control them with the dollar, if they're leaving the dollar and you can't control them with it, then what else do you have? You've got the gun. That's where we've got war.
Yeah, do you think us in America, well, Western Europe as well in particular, are in more trouble heading into the future because of being, like service industry nations, not making anything anymore, and just leisure facility economies almost?
Oh, 100%. I mean, what you've essentially got is global finance, which is the Western finance, banking families, and the international banks. They're all located in the West. We went through Great Britain. We had the monarchies, and then we had the banks move in and start to control England. And then we had the Bank of England created. Then we had all the other central banks model themselves off the Bank of England. Then we had the Federal Reserve. So global finance is the West. However, global energy is everywhere else. So what we've got right now is global finance trying to enact war against global energy. Now, that's okay. That works so long as you can keep them in your financial system and keep them in need of dollars, which works through the petrodollar because they needed dollars to pay for commodities. They were all trapped in this system. So the US could print infinite amounts of dollars, and the rest of the world had to gobble those dollars up because they had an artificial need for it. So, that it's not because they needed a commodity off the US, they needed something to pay for commodities. That was the trick that they pulled with Kissinger after the Bretton Woods system collapsed. And it worked for a long time. However, we've reached the end of the road for that now, because China's now, it's overtaken the US economically in, when it comes to, if you go for purchasing parity, and it'll soon overtake them technologically and also militarily. You're talking within the next decade, some people estimate. So the US, if it wants to make its move and stop that happening, stop the rise of China, and the key part of that is the economic rise too, where they're actually creating a separate monetary system with the other BRICS nations, and this is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And Russia is a key architect of the new monetary system. And what they're going to go to, Matthew, is a system that doesn't use the dollar as the global reserve currency. They're going to use a basket of commodities, and they're going to create like a synthetic, let's say a digital token that's based on a basket of commodities. So it's going to be backed by real things, and they're going to use that to trade between each other so they can hold that on their balance sheets instead of dollars. Now, the moment you do that, the US is cut out the picture entirely. So what does the US have? It's got some allies in Europe that are impoverished and have massive problems at home, and it's got its own commodities. So the US will become similar to Russia. It'll have a lot of commodities within its borders, but it's not going to have the power that it has today, where it can dictate global geopolitics and tell countries what to do. So that's why the US has to stop them now before that system is up and running. Because the moment that system's up and running, all of these countries of the global south are all of a sudden going to say, see you later. We're going to this system, because in this system, our commodities that your global corporations and your monarchies have come across to our countries for thousands of years and looted our countries and took all the wealth back to their countries. Now, all of a sudden, we're able to use that to enrich ourselves, because we can use it to back our currency and raise ourselves up in this new system. And that is essentially what China's offering them. It's saying, we're not going to be the leader of this monetary system. We're all going to be in it together. And this basket of commodities, you can add if you produce grain, you can use grain to back your portion of it. If you are Chile and you've got copper reserves, you can use those underground copper reserves. If you're Russia, you can use gold and platinum and oil. And that's what they're going to do. So it's going to allow countries a more equal footing in the new monetary system. Now, of course, it's going to favor China long term, because China's the most powerful of those nations, the most technologically advanced. But those other countries don't mind, because it's better for them and their people than the US system. All the US system did was say, we're the boss, we're coming in, we're taking your stuff, and if you don't like it, we're going to do a regime change. And, in Latin America, there was dozens and dozens of regime changes. In fact, I think since 1945, the end of World War II, the US has been involved in over 90 wars and regime changes across the world, in pursuit of imperialism, and over 20 million dead at least. So, people who think that America is this, arbiter of democracy going around the world liberating people, that's the propaganda of living within the empire. But everyone outside of the empire, and we're talking, the majority of the world's population, we've only got, I think, what is it, in Europe and America, I think we're talking like 10% of the world's population, 10 or 15%. Everyone else doesn't think like that. Everyone else despises imperialism of Great Britain and also America. They're quite happy for their countries now to be going off towards the BRICS system. So, that's where we stand, and that's this precipice moment now where we've got a rising superpower challenging an existing one, and we've got basically all the makings of a war. Now, I say that World War III has already begun. I say it begun in 2019. The release of COVID, which we know was funded by the National Institute of Health and Eco Health Alliance, and it was basically designed by the West, that triggered a war-type footing in the entire world. What happened in 2020 and 2021 was basically basically a phony war. We went onto a war-type footing. We closed down the borders. We repurposed industry. We printed lots of money, and we got everyone psychologically into this war-type mindset. Now, immediately when all that happened, I said to my wife, "There's going to be a war." And she went, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, tell me a time in history when they've done the things they've now done that wasn't a war." And she went, "Oh yeah, closing down borders. When did they ever do that but a war? When did they stop people traveling? When did they print tons of money and make everyone panic?" And so I said, "This is a phony war." And I said, "What comes next will be an actual war." Then sure enough, we got the proxy war in Ukraine. And I think most people now understand, people who are able to see past propaganda, that it is a proxy war. And we know that because all the people of Europe have been sacrificed for it. The European governments, you talked at the start about sovereign governments, and I said there is no sovereign government. Everyone in Europe is being sacrificed. And I mean, I could take you through the numbers of just how screwed Europe is when it comes to energy, but I won't bore you with it. But essentially, where they stand now, we've got German industry that is going to collapse. It's just the whole of Europe now is just going to be hollowed out. That's going to happen in a very short space of time. We're going to have massive excess deaths going into the winter. Old people and vulnerable people, they're gonna not have enough energy. They're gonna turn down the heating, and we'll have huge spikes in excess deaths. And nobody's speaking about those things because, of course, it goes against the drive for war and the drive for more war. So, this is why we are in World War III. World War III is not going to be like World War II. It's more complicated. It's a hybrid war. It's going to be a biological war. That is what 2020 and 2021 was. That was the first strike of a biological war. It was also the testing ground to test out the different mechanisms that they will use should there be an actual biological strike. Because, of course, if you're going to enact war and you've never dealt with a biological strike, you need to know how we're going to try and manage it. Also, it was about increasing totalitarianism and social controls in case they need to, for example, if the financial system collapses. You imagine waking up in a world where you can't access your bank and you find out, actually, my pension's just gone. Well, you might have some angry people on the street. So, it was used for many different things. And if I wrote a list of all the things 2020 and 2021 was used for, it would list thousands of different things because it was so well thought through. They used it for so many different things. However, one of the big ones was to get people ready for this war-type footing that we are now on indefinitely. We don't know where it's going to go. It could go to nuclear war. Yes, it could. They could do a nuclear strike because that could advance their overall agenda in this. So, it's definitely scary times. It's definitely a time to trying to take back control of, your basic necessities and needs. Energy, food, water. All of these things are at threat. And people would have never have believed that maybe 10 years ago, living the lives of comfort that we had in the West, that one day people would be waking up to the prospect of having no energy, to having blackouts, to having to eat bugs to survive. That's one of the ones that we're hearing now. Next year, I think I saw an article today saying Aldi are considering making products with bugs in it to help people deal with the food inflation. It's like, isn't that interesting? It's bugs. Why would it be bugs, Matthew? Why wouldn't it be learning or teaching people how to grow a garden? I could teach you how to grow potatoes at home in 10 minutes. You could grow them in your cupboard, You'll have no food problems. However, that's not what it's about, is it? It's about this overall agenda that they're trying to push, and all of the crises further that agenda. And of course, you've got this kind of other theme that's going on, which is this East versus West and West versus East battle for supremacy in the coming 100 years. Now, some people might say, well, wait a minute, you said that at the start, you said, that a lot of these narratives are just kind of fantasy and like a theater, because it's this one group of people at the top who are just controlling things. Well, that's where it gets extremely complex. You know what I mean? Where does that end and where does that begin? None of us know that. We don't know. Like I said, it's very, very complex. There's lots of different powers at play. Maybe it is all just one big drama that we get to live through, while they're just playing a game of chess with our lives. We don't know. We don't know. All we can do is try and see as far into it as we can, and also accept that there's some things that are unknowable, and we don't want to sit there like conspiracy theorists, just constantly believing that everything's a lie and everyone's a shill. We do have to accept that whether it was planned or not, a nuclear strike could happen. You know what I mean? It could happen, whether it was contrived or otherwise. So therefore, you have to prepare for it as though it is a real threat. What happened in 2020 and 2021, whether you say, oh, they released a biological weapon or they didn't, doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because they enacted the controls and played through a scenario as though it was there. And you still had to live through it. You still had to deal with it. You know what I mean? So no matter how conspiratorial you want to be, it doesn't really matter. It's actually happening. We have to deal with it. Like I said, I just always keep that door open to the fact that there is lots more going on that we don't know. And it's our job to try and sift through it as much as we can without losing our minds.
Yeah, it is very difficult not to go down like conspiratorial routes, and also there's it's almost become a dirty word, unfortunately. Where like if we have these thoughts and opinions about what's actually happening and what might happen in the future, you just get labeled a conspiracy theorist. But I mean, ultimately, some of these theories, it makes the world make more sense. And just because they aren't necessarily on mainstream media doesn't mean these things aren't true and aren't happening. It's not necessarily presented to the masses. In terms of America, yeah, I'm certainly concerned that they would take everyone with them instead of allowing their hegemony to be questioned at this stage. But you mentioned earlier about the population. It's interesting to note, like only 10-15% of us in the world live in this relatively Western comfort, which would kind of imply that if the West lost its hegemony, that the rest of the world would be better off, which is quite an interesting thing to contemplate. It does kind of make you wonder, well, not are we on the wrong side, but, is our relative prosperity, well, it's fairly obvious that our relative prosperity does directly impoverish many other people around the world. But how do you resolve that in your own mind?
One thing that I would say on that, Matthew, is it's kind of, there is this whole, China and Russia are kind of pushing that narrative as well, because obviously it's part of their psychological war and information war to say, well, look at you guys in the West, and look at the Western powers, the colonialism, you used slave labor, you went around the world, you took trillions out of countries like India, trillions in wealth, you brought it back home and enriched yourself. And now all of these other countries have started, all these other countries are now starting to try and raise themselves up, but you've taken so much. So they say you're hypocrites. You're talking about our countries, you're talking about the way we lead, about being authoritarians, X, Y, and Z, but you're all hypocrites. And it's true. It's true. However, there is one big caveat to that. And that is, if you look back at your own ancestry and my ancestry, our great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and beyond were slaves in their own country. That wealth didn't come back to us. If you look at Victorian England, our great ancestors were poor. They were living in filth. They'll have been living in one room, potentially with 15 to 20 other people. Most of the kids would have died very, very young. The rest of them would have been put into a workhouse aged 2. You know what I mean? Losing limbs on machines. That's what Victorian England was like. And before that, it was serfdom. So it's not really true to say that we raised up our lives over here. What happened was the monarchies and the wealthy elite went across these countries and brought back all of this wealth. You know, the big jewel in the Queen's crown, that was from India. Can't remember its name. And she's also got the largest diamond in the world that came out of South Africa. You know, that's where these things came from. So I always try and correct people on that because, you know, a lot of people like to lay the blame at people in the West as though we are representative of the Western elites, but we're not. You know, we wouldn't have chose that. And like I said, our ancestors were enslaved also in their own time. However, it is true that we have a much higher standard of living now in the modern era. But remember, this only came after the end of World War II. So this is really a direct result of America becoming hegemon. You know, if you had, when the British were in power, when we were when sterling was the global reserve currency and we were the global hegemon, we treat our people like slaves, you know, our own people, me and you. However, America's wealth through capitalism, because remember in Great Britain, we had family capitalism. So the wealth was all contained within families. So it didn't really spread through the system, whereas with the American system actually has spread through the system. So that's why we've got a good standard of living in the West. You know, we had a far higher standard of living and we lived far longer post World War II, which was when the Americans had already taken over. You know, they were now the hegemon. So it's worth remembering that. And like I said, we're going to see lots of these narratives in the coming years about, you know, it's going to be anti-Western, anti-imperialism. And it does make you think, as somebody in the West, which side am I on here? Like, you know what I mean? I understand why people would be saying that. But you also have to factor in that we did export a lot of technology. We did raise the standard of living in other countries. And lots of these countries were very barbaric. Doesn't mean it was right. But what I'm saying is they're very complex issues. And I am absolutely 100% against collective guilt. So, you know, if you're saying one person, because they're from a certain race or ethnicity or group, is responsible for what other people did hundreds of years ago, absolutely wrong. And it always will be. Now, what you could say is there are people that still have a lot of power and wealth today who shouldn't have all that power and wealth. And maybe they should start to give some of that wealth back to the people they took it from. You know, I was born with £0, 0 pence in my bank account. You know what I mean? So I can't give anything that I've got unless I want to give it to charity. However, there are people who were born with hundreds of billions in their bank account. And if you trace back where that came from, it came from theft. You know, theft from other nations. So, you know, I think we really need to be very specific when we're pointing out who was responsible for that theft and who is responsible now for paying it back. And yeah, and like I said, you know, this is going to be a growing narrative, and you know, the West is going to become increasingly isolated. However, you know, there is lots of roads it could go down too. I expect to see huge anti-American sentiment in Europe. You know, when we get to this winter and there's people in Europe who genuinely are unable to heat their houses, and then you get like late this year, we're already seeing German industry just collapse. I think the other day I saw a list of at least 6 German companies that have been around over 100 years. So we're talking companies that survived World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, famine post World War II, the Weimar hyperinflation, and they've all gone under in the past week or so. So this is serious. And of course, that's going to lead to a systemic financial crisis too. All of those companies will have debts and counterparties to those debts in the commercial banks. So then you get another banking crisis, which will have to be bailed out by printing more money. Then you get inflation come back even higher. So we're in this death spiral now, and Europe is going to be the epicenter of that, sadly. And I don't think those Europeans are going to feel too great about America come January, February next year. Even worse in 6 months. You know, what happens then if we have the food crisis because of what happened this year? You know, people are going to look for someone to blame. And of course, in the West, they're going to try and point that direction towards Putin and Russia. However, if you look at what's actually happening on the ground in Europe, what you're seeing is people not protesting about Russia. They're protesting their own governments and leaders for supporting a war and not supporting themselves, their own populations back at home. That's what's actually happening. You know, there's huge protests happening in the Czech Republic. There's protests now all across Germany. So I think that's only going to grow. And then, you know, people are going to say, well, wait a minute, who is in charge here? You know, you're just following America. If you're going to follow America to the point that you collapse your own industry back home that you drag your own people into poverty and starvation, people are going to soon figure out that they're just vassal states of America. You know, the vassals of America, and America is where the power lies. I mean, I think a lot of people have already cottoned on to that. So I expect Europe to be quite a chaotic place going forward. And I think America will, they may win their war, they may win their proxy war, but they have completely lost the faith and loyalty of the empire. You know, the empire now knows that the person in power, which is the US, is the mad king now. You know, it's the mad king phase of the end of empire. Well, you know, you saw this at the end of the Roman Empire, where the later emperors were tyrants. You know, they were tyrants, they were bloody, they were warmongers, they subjugated their own people to all kinds of tortures and ills. And it really feels like that now. You know, you've got a mad tyrant on the throne, unwilling to leave and step aside, and therefore we get everything that's going on in the world today.
The last thing I was kind of going to ask you about, which it kind of ties in multiple themes, is in particular because I live in Scotland, it's quite a unique situation because obviously we have an independence movement here. And also we have the North Sea, which I think could resolve a lot of the inflationary issues we're seeing in this country if we just increase the oil and gas extraction. But there doesn't seem to be any or much desire to do that. And certainly I believe there was a new financial document that the SNP were floating a few days back, which implied they were going to somehow fund this country off a Scottish pound and also still follow a net zero agenda and not extract additional oil and gas and try and move away from that. What do you make of Scotland's position in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard really to say. I think, you know, I'm not somebody who really keeps abreast of any politics as far as I can help it, besides having to kind of make sense of what's going on in the world and trying to understand where I'm being lied to is usually why I'm looking at politics, is to understand at what point, you know, we're being lied to, where the propaganda begins and ends and things like this. In terms of Scotland, like, you know, we actually spoke about potentially moving to Scotland because it's still semi-wild. You know, there's a lot of places out there where you can go and live what would be relatively a quiet life. You've got the coast all around you as well, which I think is a benefit. But in terms of actually its internal politics, I wouldn't know, Matt, to be honest. I mean, I think it means something to the people of Scotland in terms of like their identity. There's obviously a strong feeling either one way or the other, whether they want to remain a part of the rest of the Isles or to be off as an independent nation. However, like, do I think it would actually make much difference to their long term? I mean, maybe it would make difference to our long term prosperity. Yeah, I mean, maybe they could wrangle it so it was slightly more favorable for them with their offshore gas and things like this. However, you know, they're still a part of the same overall agenda. You know what I mean? They're still going to have masters to answer to. They're still going to have to meet the legal agreements that they've made in terms of net zero and Agenda 2030 and 2050. I mean, that's actually put into law. So, you know, no matter what, that's the path they're on. So if you look at what those goals are, which they've legally said that they're going to achieve, it's, you know, it will be the hollowing out of energy. You know, no matter which way you look at it, that is the goal. Like when I was looking at what they would have to achieve to meet those goals back in 2019, it was things like, you know, it was really radical things like shut down all airports in the UK, but the main ones. Eventually going to the main ones as well. So just having a couple. And it was things like, you know, no more gas boilers at all, complete end of gas, reduction of energy use by like 45-50%. And at the time, it was like, whoa, this will take a long time. You know, this will take a long time. This will take decades to do. But if you look at where we are now, if you strip all the narratives away from all the different crises, we're pretty much, you know, we're probably halfway there now. In Europe, I think we're almost there. You know what I mean? That's how quick they've managed to get us to that place, or circumstances brought us to that place. So when you look at the power behind this and the push towards these goals, I don't think any country is going to be spared from that. Maybe if you got yourself, somewhere really out the way, like Latin America or South America or an island somewhere, then you might not have these things kind of touch you for a long time. But I think Scotland's too front and center. It's always gonna be right up there with the big boys because it's attached to the UK and the UK is attached to America. So I think, it probably won't be spared in that. However, for the individual that's living there, I think it's a great place. You could have a nice life up in Scotland.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a lovely place. I just think our government actively works against the people, by trying to shut down the oil and gas, like you mentioned. Having a Green Party, which is essentially taken over the SNP as well, which is very, very dangerous. And I do think it's part of the same force that is punishing Brexit vote in Britain, that is trying to push Scotland back towards the EU, globalist forces taking control of it and whatnot. I think it is part of a destabilizing and intentionally destabilizing force, which is concerning. I think we'll be much worse off if an independence vote goes through. But I don't think there's any stomach for it. I think enough people think there's too much instability in this country in general at the minute. But you were saying about toying with moving here. It would certainly, if you'd gone to the Highlands, it's stunning up there. You would have definitely been able to build an off-grid thing. I mean, that's my long-term plan. Get up there and live exclusively off hunting deer, if possible.
Yeah. See that's the thing as well. I think all of these kind of conversations and topics are very big topics, and we are living through it, and we're already well into these things. The world today is so much different to 2019, and the prospects, the literal prospects, I don't mean the things that we're guessing about, I mean the things that are already, the dominoes that have already fallen, and the things that are going to happen now are already so huge that you really have no choice if you want to have any quality of life, if you want to, really have time to think about life, to reflect on life, so you're not just living in a constant state of panic. You really have to start pursuing self-sufficiency. And that doesn't have to be full on, it doesn't have to be full on off grid. You can be semi off grid. You can have backup systems. You can have ways of supplementing your diet with homegrown food. You don't have to be, complete, but you should be striving for that, because anything that you don't have control of in terms of your basic necessities will be used against you in the future. Because at the end of the day, all of the agendas revolve around taking back control over those things and telling you what you can do and what you can have when you can have it. How much energy can Matt use? What can he eat? We get to decide. We're in charge. That's what it's all about. It's the same with CBDCs. It's about, we're controlling the money. We can control how far you can go and where you can spend that money and what you can spend it on. It's all about control. So, this is why they are terrified of people actually doing that. And this is why you'll never, ever hear the government say, oh my God, we're going to have a food crisis. Here's how you grow a garden. We're going to hand out some seeds. We're going to plant some fruit trees alongside the road. You know what I mean? Like, you could figure that out. If you knew there was a food crisis, if I said, Matt, there's a food crisis coming, you've got 6 months to figure it out. The first thing you'd do is you'd go out and start planting. That's what you'd do. But what we're being told is there's a food crisis coming. You know what I mean? There's nothing else. Maybe we'll give you some bugs. And that is what they'll do. That is what they'll do. That's how they engender compliance with their schemes. And of course, once you get rid of the farmers, then you really are screwed, because if you don't know how to grow food, you are going to have to eat whatever you're given. And growing food's not easy. It takes time to get up to speed on that. And the big problem in the UK, particularly, is land. All the land over there is being owned for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years, by aristocrats and their families. And a lot of that land is still within those families. So, this is another problem. The cost of land is so high. So for anyone that's worried about all of these things, I would say, that's where you start. You start by taking back control over what you can. That means your finances. So, fiat money, like we spoke about today, that is, this monetary system's on its way out. So you need to have your money in things that can't be printed, because all they can do is print. And every time they print, the value of that money goes down even more. If you look at the value of the British pound in comparison to gold, which is something you can't print, it's something like it's got 0.0 something % left of its original value compared to gold over the last 100 years. And, so we're just waiting for the last few bits to go before it goes to complete zero. So there's things that you can do. You can sort out your money, you can sort out your food. This is what I talk about a lot on the channel. It's very simple stuff. It's not, go out and buy a farm. It's not about that. It's about what can you do where you are. You can make a food store for one, a good food store just to protect you, insulate yourself from serious crisis. But then beyond that, we talk about foraging. At least 2 or 3 times a week we go out and we forage. Particularly in autumn, we go out and forage for mushrooms. We supplement our diet with things that we can find in the forest. It's, these are things that anyone can learn. You can go out and get a book. You can figure these things out. And trust me, you'll have a much better quality of life if you do. You're not going to be stuck constantly watching the news and the screens, worrying about what's going to happen next. You'll actually start to embrace life in a different way. We try and stay away from screens as much as possible. Sadly, the one downside of having a broadcast and doing this kind of stuff is you do need to be connected to what's going on. But otherwise, Matt, if I didn't have to be, I would spend no time online. I'd spend all my time out planting food in the gardens, doing what I could. So that's my advice. If you're worried, start now, start simple. There's plenty of places you can get help for that. I talk a little bit about it on my channel, but mainly I focus on finance. But on my Patreon, we do a lot of things related to self-sufficiency. I did a video on building an off-grid system. So simple 1 solar panel system with an inverter, 2 batteries. We used that last year. We had 7 blackouts last year, believe it or not. Before the energy crisis ever hit, we had 7 blackouts last year. And I used this system for, I think the longest I had to use it was 4 or 5 days. And we used it throughout winter when we had -20. And that ensured that our house was comfortable. I could run a well pump. I could run all these lights in here. I could even run if I wanted to. It's a really simple system. It's cheap, but these are things you can buy now. And then when these things do happen, you're not running around panicked. If the lights go out at midnight on, Christmas Day or something, you're not going to be panicked or worried. So it's just preparing for what probably is going to come. And if it doesn't come, hey, it doesn't matter. You're still going to be happy.
Yeah, I mean, like you say with inflation anyway, you're probably better off having your money in things and stuff like generators and
100%.
whatnot, instead of just having a bank balance full of money, which is becoming more and more worthless each day. You mentioned a minute ago, we've spoken about broad topics. I mean, this has been an interesting free-flowing conversation. I had far more specific things I wanted to get into, but it's just, like you say, I think people like us, once we have found what we consider to be the greater agenda of everything, it's very difficult to go into the minutiae of things without it inevitably.
Let me ask you, Matt, before we go, what's your view? What do you see? Because you're coming at it from obviously a different angle from me. We've both got our own different backgrounds. What do you see is happening, and where do you think it's going to go? I mean, I know we might end up having a whole nother podcast if we go too far into it, but what's your views?
I mean, I'm not that dissimilar from you. I just I don't necessarily see the multipolar economic world that you are describing. Like the dismantling of the BRICS system and whatnot, and going to a Russia and China and Iran and whatnot led world. I more see it from like China's internal politics being exported to all the other countries of the world, and ultimately, like you're saying about central bank digital currencies and control systems, I can see that being implemented everywhere through a one world government type system. But then it's very difficult, like you say, it's very difficult to hold these opinions and present them to people without instantly being written off as conspiratorial. But in retrospect, looking at what has happened, you could certainly point to that grander theory as the direction of travel, if that makes sense.
So you see, what you're saying, Matt, would then lend itself to the idea that everything that's happening, all of these crises, actually are just conduits for that, what you just said. You need the conflict between the US and the East to make it seem realistic to the people that have bought into the system. But in actual fact, what we're actually seeing is a transfer of power, and we're seeing that through the Chinification of everything else in the West. So if you look in 20 years' time, we're all going to look pretty similar, despite the fact we've had these narratives that trying to say we're going, it's because of a conflict. But what you'll actually see at the end of it is we'll just all be very much the same. With the digital currency, it might have a different name in our country, but it'll be the same digital currency that they've got in China for all intents and purposes. And I agree with that. I think whichever way you look at it, China is the model. If you want to see your future, don't look at America's past, look at China now, because that's where we're heading.
I'm not saying it's necessarily done by China in an expansionary manner. I mean, it seems to be like
whether do you feel like there's people that are using China and saying, right, that's the model.
That's good. Yeah, we'll do that here. I mean, certainly you can start pointing at the World Economic Forum. I know you watched my episode with Johnny Vedmore.
That was fantastic episode. Yeah, he had a ton of information.
Yeah, he's very interesting. I feel like it's not necessarily that all these events that are happening, I believe, to be, staged or fake or anything like that. It's, I mean, certainly some of them are, but it's certainly that, like, when they go, okay, this has happened, what do we want out of this, and what do we want things to look like, and what can we do? It certainly seems that it's been, the solution always seems to, involve losses of freedoms, money, control going to a small and smaller group of people. A lot of questions come off the back of that, obviously. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. It's quite an awkward position to be in, when you're trying to just go about your life and, go to work and everything. And then you've got that in the background of, like, all news events are seen through that lens. It makes it very difficult to participate,
Yeah, for sure. You've got, the best thing you can do in those circumstances is, the more complex things get outside is just the more simplified you make it back at home. Like you said, if you go and do what you want to do in Scotland, if you have your off-grid place and, you build, we might go into this future that's going to be very dystopian and totalitarian. And that's what it is. It's totalitarian. But despite that, you can build a pocket of, freedom for yourself, where you do things that enrich your life. You can appreciate art and beauty and culture, free speech within your little confines of your home and with your community. And that could be an extended one. We've all got our little spaces. It's like a satellite grid. I'll get in touch with you. You'll get in touch with me, vice versa. We'll be dotted around the world. And it's a parallel system. That's how it works. That's what happened in Europe in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when the Soviets were in power. Totalitarianism reigned, but there was a parallel system that still existed, and people, they might have gone along with stuff to stop themselves getting truncheoned to death. However, in their private lives, they were rebelling against it, and they were conspiring against it at all times, and trying to retain freedoms, trying to retain truth. That's the key part of it, isn't it? Because as long as you know that all that stuff exists, you also know you're being lied to, and that's the main, that you are living in it. Because there are a lot of people living in it, and those people, sadly, I think they're all heading towards potentially their own annihilation, if not physically, psychologically at least.
Yeah, absolutely. But then I often wonder if I'm causing my own psychological annihilation by getting so entrenched into looking at these things. But no, you've certainly got the right idea, speaking about parallel systems and trying to go off the grid, even if it is just a little bit. Where can people find your channel, find more of your work, get more information from you?
Yeah, sure. So you can find my channel on YouTube if you search for Parallel Systems Broadcast, and we talk mainly about freedom and finance, although it is indeterminate how long it will last on YouTube, because there's only so much you can say. You have to be very creative in how you discuss certain topics, let's put it that way. So you can also find me on Rumble. That's rumble.com/parallel systems. And I also produce a newsletter called the Parallel Bear newsletter, which is all about, again, finance and keeping prepared. So that's on my Patreon. So you can check me out anywhere. If you email me, I always respond to people. You don't have to subscribe to anything. If you want to chat about anything that we've discussed here, drop me an email and I'll try and get back to you when I can.
Didn't realise I was muted there. It's been great speaking to you today. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome, Matthew. You too. And good luck with the podcast, and I'll stay tuned myself.
Join us next time for the Political Darkside podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It was just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.